So here's a handy, easy to read and understandable graphic about UN structure. Questions? No. So it's incredibly complicated, as you can see, and this doesn't even include everything that's going on at the UN. So I just wanted to give you a little bit of brief context because it matters in terms of understanding where the SDGs came from, why they're important, and where they're going. So the UN was established in 1945 in the aftermath of World War II to promote peace, cooperation, and well-being for all. And it's grounded in principles of sovereignty, territorial integrity, and the peaceful resolution of conflicts. The intent was to provide a framework for international cooperation, which of course is fundamental to addressing global challenges. When it was first signed in 1945, 50 countries became members, but as of today, there are 193 member states of the UN. As you can see on the far left, there are 6 principal organs of the UN, with the UN General Assembly serving as the primary deliberative body. So each year, world leaders gather at the General Assembly's annual session, which theoretically allows for discussions on collaborative strategies to address global challenges. Under each principal organ are various UN agencies and programs. And again, you can see that sort of in this chart here. These specialized bodies provide expertise, resources, and coordination to ensure that progress is made toward achieving UN goals, including the goals of the SDGs, as we're going to talk about. So some examples of these agencies are ones that you've heard of course, the United Nations Development Program, UNDP, UNICEF, UN Women, and the World Food Program, WFP. But one of the most important agencies for purposes of the SDGs is the United Nations Environment Program, also known as UNEP. And if you haven't already figured it out, the UN is nothing but acronyms, and keeping them straight can be a little bit of a challenge. So let's talk about UNEP. As you can see from this slide, UNEP's mission is to inspire, inform, and enable nations and peoples to improve their quality of life without compromising that of future generations. The United Nations Environmental Assembly, UNEA, is the biennial assembly of UNEP. So basically, it's the people who come together every couple of years in Nairobi, where UNEP is located. And it's the world's highest level decision-making body on the environment. It has full membership of all 193 UN member states and the involvement of major groups and stakeholders. That includes people from academia, NGOs, nonprofits, civil society. UNEA meets to set priorities for global environmental policies and development of international environmental law. UNEA is important because of its full membership, first of all, which provides the broad participation necessary to provide leadership and to catalyze intergovernmental action on key environmental issues. So UNEP and the Food and Agricultural Organization, FAO, they provide detailed analysis and recommendations for achieving specific goals. And these reports help countries identify gaps in their policies and practices, making SDG implementation more effective. So now that we have some baseline information just about UN structure, let's turn our attention specifically to the SDGs. So here's a little bit of a roadmap of what we're going to be talking about. There is a 50-year history leading to the development of the SDGs. And so we're going to just briefly look at each phase of that development. And as you will soon learn, the SDGs resonate deeply with the core principles of the UN Charter. They fundamentally emphasize peace, justice, human rights, and the well-being of people worldwide. So first, let's look at the development decades. The historical origin of the SDGs is generally traced to the 1972 UN Conference on the Human Environment in Stockholm. It was at this conference that the tension between environmental factors such as sustainability and economic development was first articulated at a multinational level. So let me explain. So development and sustainability were seen as simply incompatible, as the former aims to promote resource extraction and goods production, and the latter seeks to limit that same extraction and production. So discourse at that 1972 conference in Stockholm really sought to challenge this notion that these concepts were inherently mutually exclusive. Also in 1972, the Club of Rome, and I don't know if you know what the Club of Rome is, but it is this nonpartisan independent organization that was established around 1970, principally of scientists and intellectuals, and they put together studies that tried to influence international policy. And what they did was in 1972, it was their first major paper that they came out with. They published what became very influential, a paper called Limits to Growth, which suggested that global issues were inextricably linked and, as a result, had to be addressed comprehensively. And interestingly, this report is sometimes credited with really launching the sustainability movement. So the next step toward the merging of sustainability and development came with the launch of the World Commission on Environment and Development by the General Assembly of the United Nations in 1982. This commission consisted of members from the global north and the global south and aimed to come up with ways that conservation could be employed to further economic development. In 1987, the commission published its report called Our Common Future, which introduced a standard definition of sustainable development. And it is, and I quote, "Development means that which meets the needs of the present without compromising the ability of future generations to meet their own needs." The 1992 UN Conference on Environment and Development, it was also known as the Rio Earth Summit, sought to initiate sustainable development globally. 172 states participated and signed 3 non-binding agreements, Agenda 21, Rio Declaration, and the Statement of Forest Principles, as well as 2 legally binding conventions, the Framework Convention on Climate Change and the Convention on Biological Diversity. This Earth Summit also resulted in the establishment of the UN Commission on Sustainable Development in order to follow up on those aforementioned agreements and conventions. So now there were several binding and non-binding agreements in place that set the stage for specific goals to be developed. The year 2000 saw the emergence of the SDGs predecessors, the Millennium Development Goals, or MDGs, of which there were 8, and you can see them right here. And they were adopted unanimously by the UN General Assembly with the goal that they would be achieved by 2015, so within 15 years. While these were hopeful and aspirational, the MDGs largely lacked integration between goals sharing common issues, which led to the inefficient use of resources and let some goals get ahead and others were lagging behind. And additionally, while the MDGs reached the governments of countries, they failed to engage other major stakeholders and key actors like academia and civil society that would have served a significant role in implementation and monitoring. So the lessons that were learned from these challenges of the MDGs would go on to inform the drafting of the modern SDGs when the MDGs lapsed in 2015. The 2012 Conference on Sustainable Development mandated that SDGs be developed, and an open working group was tasked with developing them. In addition to government representation, stakeholders then did include from many regions, organizations, policy domains, academia, civil society, NGOs, and they all contributed to the development of the goals. A so-called zero draft of July 2014 evolved from this broad political negotiation, and then the final SDGs were signed in September 2015 at what is now thought of as being a fairly historic UN summit, again with a 15-year time frame. So the end goal would be 2030, that some of these things would be achieved by 2030. So the SDGs were really born from the need for action-oriented, concise, aspirational, and universal goals to address the shortcomings of the MDGs. And because it was drafted with the assistance of academia, civil society, think tanks, private sector companies, the SDGs really prioritize the inclusion of relevant stakeholders from all aspects of society. There are 17 Sustainable Development Goals. Goals 1 through 6 build on and expand the work of the MDGs, the 8 MDGs, whereas goals 7 through 17 expand the work of sustainable development to address core causes of inequality and poverty, the human impact on the environment and its resulting effect on social and economic development, and work to create the political will and collaboration to achieve the goals of the SDGs. To address implementation issues, which was an issue with MDG, the SDGs are also individually supported by 231 target indicators that act as benchmarks representing progress toward or away from any particular goal. So as an example, SDG goal number 1, and I'm going to show you all the goals in just a moment, focuses on poverty, just eliminating poverty. So the targets and the indicators include the following. So one target is by 2030, eradicate extreme poverty for all people everywhere, currently measured as people living on less than $1.25 a day. The indicator that we've reached that target would be looking at the proportion of the population living below the international poverty line by sex, age, employment status, and geographic location. Another target under that first SDG is by 2030, reduce at least by half the proportion of men, women, and children of all ages living in poverty in all its dimensions according to national definitions. And the indicators would be looking at the proportion of population living below the national poverty line by sex and age, and the proportion of men, women, and children of all ages living in poverty in all the dimensions according to national definitions. So there are these targets and indicators for all 17. Right now, there are 231 of them. So the SDGs and their indicators embrace a much broader and integrated agenda than the MDGs, and they are grounded in human rights, governance, justice, and equity, all of which were not really satisfactorily prevalent in the MDGs, according to some critics. So let's take a look at the Sustainable Development Goals. Can you read what they say? Is it legible enough, or do you want me to? I can read through. Okay, good. So what's interesting is that the SDGs are not merely formally integrated into the structure of the United Nations, but they're really central to the UN's mission as described in the organization's charter and principles. And as you will notice, not one of the SDGs specifically references animal welfare. But it's, as you look at least the titles, you can guess what all of these SDGs are really focused on, right? It's not a huge leap of logic to see that animal welfare really matters to virtually every one of these SDGs, and certainly to the success of these SDGs. So something that's been happening for the last several years is a lot of people in the nonprofit and the NGO sector, they've been working to try to figure out a way to get animal welfare principles introduced into the SDG conversations. And so there was a nice development in 1922 when the United Nations Environment Assembly, so UNEA, so that, remember, that's the biennial group that meets under UNEP, they met in Nairobi, which is where it's located, and they passed a resolution acknowledging the role animal welfare can play in addressing environmental challenges and achieving the Sustainable Development Goals. So this was a really big deal because it was the first time that animal welfare had really even been discussed at this level, and certainly acknowledged as something that was important to consider. So this resolution is part of the UN's One Health approach, which was a post-COVID ideology, which aims to balance and optimize the health of people, animals, and the environment. And the UNEA resolution highlighted the interconnected nexus between the health and welfare of animals, sustainable development, and the health and well-being of humans. And to further understanding of this nexus, the UNEA requested the collaboration of the FAO, the Food and Agriculture Organization, the WHO, the World Health Organization, the World Organization for Animal Health, and the One Health high-level expert panel to prepare a report analyzing the connection between animal welfare and sustainable development. Now, to be clear, that report has not yet been done. It hasn't even started yet. We're still looking at trying to find appropriate funding because it's quite expensive to do something like that. But the hope is that when complete, the report will serve as a roadmap for the integration of animal welfare across all of the SDGs as part of the UN's larger One Health campaign. So thanks for sticking with me. I know this was a little bit dense, but I think it is important to understand the context and to understand a little bit about how the UN operates. And so at this point, I'm very pleased to turn the podium over to my colleague, Dana, who is going to now be able to zero in on one of the SDGs in particular and really highlight how the animal welfare aspect is so critical to the SDGs. Thank you.
Thank you, Pam, and thank you, Hira. It is wonderful to be here. Thank you to ALDF and CALS and all the sponsors, including Brooks. And thank you to all of you. I can't help but think every time I come to an animal law conference, I think back to the first animal law conference I went to, which was well over a decade ago. And I sat in the audience and I did not work in the field of animal law. And I listened to Joyce Tischler speak and I cried silently in the audience because it was what I really wanted to do. And I felt so activated by the speakers and the presentations and by the community of like-minded folks. And I sense the same thing today and every time I come to this conference. There's a lot of activation in this room and it's really heartwarming to be a part of it. So thank you for all being here today. My focus and my remarks will be on climate, the UN, and animals. Thank you so much, Pam, for the helpful background grounding us in the Sustainable Development Goals. My remarks will focus on Sustainable Development Goal number 13, which calls on nations to take urgent action to combat climate change and its impacts. It works hand in hand, this goal, with the UNFCCC. I always want to put more F's and fewer C's in there, but that is the United Nations Framework Convention on Climate Change. And as you got a sense from Pam's remarks, the UN Framework on Climate Change really grew up hand in hand with the Sustainable Development Goals. So the UNFCCC was signed in 1992 at the Earth Summit in Rio. It was ratified by the United States in 1994. That's back when the US Senate used to ratify major treaties. I hope they do one day again. And since then, this framework convention has been the basis for really impactful international climate negotiations, most recently culminating in the Paris Agreement, which was signed in 2015 in Paris at what's called the Conference of the Parties. That's another relevant acronym here, COP. That's an annual meeting of the parties to the UN Framework Convention on Climate Change. And at COP21 in Paris, the Paris Agreement was adopted. It's been nearly universally adopted. The US joined in 2015. You may remember or want to forget that we briefly left the agreement in 2017, and thankfully we are now back in. Whereas the Framework Convention required Senate ratification, the Paris Agreement was accomplished through executive approval. The Paris Agreement in principle, if you think of it at its most basic level, it's countries coming together to agree to reduce greenhouse gas emissions rapidly. It's also important for countries to build resilience and be prepared to adapt to climate change. Climate change is already upon us. It's no longer a question. I studied climate change in college. We called it global warming then. And at that point, it might have been a question of avoiding the impacts of climate change. We're already there, and we have to face the reality of adapting to those effects. Another really important principle of the Paris Agreement is that there must be adequate support for developing countries through the Framework Convention and through the activities. And that's a recognition both of the historical responsibility of developing countries for climate emissions and the need for support in developing countries who bear less historical responsibility. And if you think if you sum it down as far as you can, the primary goal of the Paris Agreement is to keep average global temperatures well below 2 degrees Celsius above pre-industrial levels. And the world has interpreted that well below, and the scientific consensus has emerged that we have to keep global average temperature rise as close as possible to 1.5 degrees Celsius above pre-industrial levels to avoid the worst effects of climate change. We already have effects, but if we want to avoid the worst, we have to stay below 1.5 degrees Celsius. And again, the Paris Agreement was part of this 2015 Agenda for Sustainable Development that Pam just talked about, that the Sustainable Development Goals came out of. The next COP, or Conference of the Parties, will take place in Dubai in the United Arab Emirates at the end of this year. It promises to be a very interesting year for food systems at the COP. I'll talk a little bit about that later, but really the most interesting year that we've seen to date. Just to finish my opening remarks, I wanted to talk briefly about where we are now and what is the climate situation that the parties will be confronting when they come together in Dubai. The situation is grim and the situation is urgent. The UN issued a report in the summer of this year on the Sustainable Development Goals, and I just wanted to briefly quote some of the language to give you a sense of how the UN is seeing climate problems. This is a quote: "With a climate cataclysm looming, the pace and scale of current climate action plans are wholly insufficient to effectively tackle climate change." And the UN also observed, if we want to limit global warming to 1.5 degrees Celsius above pre-industrial levels, we have to already be decreasing emissions, and we have to cut them almost by half by 2030, which is just 7 years away. So time is of the essence and action needs to be taken now. On the back page of that report, you can see a quote from the UN Secretary General Antonio Guterres. He says, "Unless we act now, the 2030 agenda will become an epitaph for a world that might have been." The urgency is because the world has already warmed on average 1.3 degrees Celsius above pre-industrial levels. That's very close to 1.5 degrees Celsius. This summer, we saw, as we all know, we saw record temperatures in the Northern Hemisphere. We saw record heat and humidity, devastating fires around the world in Canada and in Hawaii, deadly flooding in Libya, flooding in Asia and elsewhere. We saw marine heat waves that had a large-scale coral bleaching event in the Caribbean and Gulf of Mexico. That's when coral, the animal, expels the symbiotic algae that lives inside it that is required for the coral's life under stress, and it can lead to mass die-offs of coral reefs. Some scientists have started to use words like mind-boggling or staggering for the heat increase that we saw this summer. And they're concerned that what we might be seeing now and already living in is an accelerating warming trend. It is an El Nino year. This year, you know, climate scientists are very careful to not jump to conclusions and not read patterns into noise, but more and more scientists are deeply disturbed by the temperature increases that we've seen this summer. This graph represents, each of these lines on this graph is a global average temperature starting from 1850. The lighter orange lines at the bottom, those are from longer ago, and the darker red lines are more recent. And what you see at the top of the graph here is that the September global average temperature was much higher than it has ever been. I mentioned, you'll see that the September global average temperature was 1.8 degrees Celsius above pre-industrial levels. That's actually above the 1.5 goal, and that's because the 1.5 goal is calculated based on averages across many years, but we're actually starting to now exceed that in individual years. And that's not a good sign. It's not a good sign for many reasons, including because it can trigger what are called climate tipping points. Those are when you have changes to large parts of the climate system that become self-perpetuating after a certain level of warming. Climate experts are telling us that this year will almost certainly be the hottest year ever on record, hottest year in the last 2,000 years, and probably for much longer than that. So that was the stage setting. I wanted to talk about UN and the climate and the current situation and get more into animals in our conversation. So thank you.
Thank you so much, both of you, for those wonderful opening remarks and presentations. So just to kick off our roundtable discussion, and I'll start with you, Dana. Can you speak a little bit about how our treatment of animals is actually fueling the climate crisis, or how it's contributing to it?
Yes, I would love to. And actually, I'm going to go back because I forgot the clicker, but I have a couple more slides. You might think of, there's a lot of human processes that harm animals. You might think about deforestation or habitat destruction. But if you think about our direct treatment of animals, what is the driver, the main driver, the critical driver of the climate crisis? It is animal agriculture at the scale and the level of industrialization that it is practiced today. We had some great information from Christine Bell Blakely yesterday about this, so I'll try and move quickly through it. But animal agriculture produces greenhouse gases through a number of mechanisms. Very big impact is the feed production, all of the greenhouse gases associated with growing the food for animals, land use change that goes along with that, manure management we heard about from Christine. In some systems, manure is collected in anaerobic vats, lagoons, containers without oxygen, where it produces methane. When manure is spread or dropped, deposited on fields in the presence of oxygen, it creates nitrous oxide, which is another very potent greenhouse gas. We have the slaughter of animals, transportation, processing, all of those things require energy and create greenhouse gases. And enteric fermentation is a huge contributor to animal agriculture's climate footprint. That's a natural process in the digestive systems of ruminants where they digest plants and create methane. So how significant is animal agriculture as a driver of climate change? The answer in a word is very. I am not a climate scientist. I will not pretend to be a climate scientist. If there are any climate scientists in here, I apologize, but I try to keep my remarks simple and at the level that I can understand. Depending on the calculations and assumptions, which there are a lot of assumptions and estimates built into these things, experts have estimated that animal agriculture is responsible for anywhere between 11% and 20% of all man-made greenhouse gas emissions. That's animal agriculture. I'm not talking about all of agriculture, just animal agriculture. One peer-reviewed study put it at 19.6%. The UN Food and Agriculture Organization, which Pam spoke about, their first estimate was 18%. They later revised their model, reduced it to 14.5%, and then most recently have reduced their estimate to 11.1%. Why is the Food and Agriculture Organization's estimate coming down? I don't know. As I mentioned, there's a lot of uncertainty in these estimations, but there is some concern about why the Food and Agriculture Organization's estimates have decreased so dramatically over time. And for folks who are interested in this, I'll direct you to just on Friday, 2 days ago, there was a Guardian exclusive report by Arthur Neslin. The headline was How UN Food Body Played Down Role of Farming in Climate Change. And what the report said is that ex-officials of the UN Food and Agriculture Organization say that the leadership of the organization censored and undermined them when they highlighted how livestock methane is a major greenhouse gas. So that's very concerning if there was pressure put on leaders and scientists in the Food and Agriculture Organization, because of course we all have to rely on this data. We are, as I mentioned, this is a critical decade and we need the best information we possibly can have. But in any event, at either end of that range, animal agriculture, its emissions are massive and significant. And it's even more significant when you look at climate superpollutants, in particular nitrous oxide and methane. Nitrous oxide, the UN, it's again very difficult to calculate, but the UN has estimated that about half of all nitrous oxide emissions come from livestock, again from animal agriculture. It is an incredibly potent warming gas. It is 280 times more powerful than carbon dioxide as a warming agent over its first 20 years in the atmosphere. So it's a very impactful greenhouse gas. As to methane, animal agriculture globally, according to UN estimates, is responsible for about 1/3 of all methane. In the US, it is, we heard this from Christine also, it's the largest US source of methane, according to the EPA. If you combine enteric fermentation and manure management, if those were together on this chart, the chart would have to be a lot longer, and that would be the absolute top row. Methane also, it's called a super climate pollutant because it's about 80 times more potent than carbon dioxide in its first 20 years in the atmosphere. One of the things about carbon dioxide is that it can persist in the atmosphere. It does persist in the atmosphere for hundreds of years. This is why we have baked in global warming based on emissions of carbon, from decades and hundreds of years ago. It sticks around and has a warming effect. Methane is different. It largely dissipates in a couple of decades. And for this reason, leaders in the UN and policy leaders around the world are really starting to focus on methane. And the thinking is that if we could reduce methane emissions in the near term, it would actually bring down warming in the near and medium term and give us time as we continue to decarbonize the economy. One of the authors of a 2021 Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change report, another one, the IPCC, is the UN body that assesses the science of climate change. They come out with periodic reports that make it into the headlines, often very scary headlines. One of the lead authors of the 2021 report said, quote, "Cutting methane is the biggest opportunity to slow warming between now and 2040. We need to face this emergency." There's even excellent and scary research that shows that if we stopped burning fossil fuels tomorrow, and we did not reduce the climate superpollutants like methane and nitrous oxide, we would still fail to meet the Paris climate goals. So unfortunately for us, we have to do these two things at once. We have to decarbonize and we have to take action on these other substances. That is how our treatment of animals is central to the problem of climate change. It's because of animal agriculture's huge greenhouse gas footprint, and it's because of the opportunity presented by these short-lived climate pollutants. Thanks.
Thank you. My next question, Pam, is for you, because you mentioned that none of the SDGs actually expressly mention animal welfare. So why has there been such a resistance to including animal welfare in the SDGs?
Well, I think it's no surprise to anybody in this room that there has always been resistance to animal welfare principles and progress on a local, state, federal, and international level. And so the SDGs are no exception to that. But in addition, we have other things that we have to consider. Number one of the principles of the UN Charter is sovereignty. And so a lot of countries are saying, wait a second, animal welfare is something that we should be doing within our own country. We don't want this international organization to be telling us how the types of laws that we should be passing or how we should be addressing these things. So it really gets into, yeah, I'm a sovereign nation, and we're going to be able to do whatever we want to do. Number two is that it's a priority or not a priority. And again, a lot of nations are saying we have extreme poverty, we've got education issues, we have all sorts of other issues that we're trying to address. Animal welfare simply doesn't rise to the top of the list right now. We're just not going to deal with it. Of course, one of the things that we argue is that no, it's all linked, and you're going to be able to achieve those things if you do include animal welfare, but it's not always perceived that way. I think that there's also an issue about resources. I don't have the numbers at the top of my head, but it's something like, in order to achieve the SDGs, they're anticipating it's going to take something like $3.3 to $4.5 trillion. And right now we're in a deficit situation of like 3.3 trillion. I mean, just the numbers are huge. There's not enough money, and there's a lot of competition for those resources. So and then of course you have political and cultural issues. You've got other priorities that pop up. So it becomes a very difficult environment when you start thinking about it that way. Nonetheless, I do think the powerful message, and I think Dana, her presentation highlights this incredibly well, is that we have to be thinking about the animal. If you want to do any of these, you don't need to care about the animals, but you have to care about this animal welfare issue if you want to achieve any of these SDGs.
Thank you. So back to you, Dana. You talked about how we're contributing to climate change through our treatment of animals, but how is the climate crisis affecting animals themselves?
Yeah, it's a very important question. And the reality of the climate crisis and the changes that we are already seeing and that we will see is that it will dramatically impact every cause that you care about, whether it's human rights or democracy or labor or pollution. You think about the oceans, the forests, you think about animals, these effects are going to be very dramatic. And in fact, they already are. And before I talk a little bit about climate change and how it impacts animals, I just wanted to acknowledge at the outset that this is tough stuff. It's sad stuff. And I always think my prior job was with Mercy for Animals, which is a farmed animal protection organization. And when I got my current job at Yale Law School, leading the climate change and animal agriculture litigation initiative, my mother said to me, what, factory farming wasn't depressing enough for you? You had to add in climate change. And that's true. But the reason that I work on this and the reason you all are here today is because we care deeply about these issues and we want to know what we can do about them. But I think it's so important that, what I try and do for myself and what I encourage all of you to do as you listen to this information about climate and animals, and as you work on all of the causes that you care about, is really take care of yourself, notice how you are feeling, take a break when you need to, seek support. And it's really important for us to build self-care and resilience into this work. But the reason I want to talk about it is because we need to acknowledge these harms and we need to let these harms motivate us to take action. And that's part of what makes me feel better, is when you can find ways to take action on these issues that we care about. So thinking about animals and climate change, I'm going to do this fairly quickly, but I think about it in terms of categories of animals. So think about different kinds of animals that we keep in confined situations and how they might be impacted by climate change, by extreme weather events, for example. Yesterday, Christine showed us a picture of what happened to farmed animals in North Carolina in hurricanes. We've seen that repeatedly. Companion animals in shelters are vulnerable to extreme weather events. There was a heartbreaking story from the Bahamas in 2019 when Hurricane Dorian hit. The neighbors could hear the dogs in the shelter barking until they could no longer hear them. Zoos, laboratories, aquariums, they're all vulnerable in these events. After Hurricane Katrina, almost all of the 10,000 fishes in the New Orleans aquarium died when the generators failed after that storm. Farm sanctuaries are affected by these events. I don't know if any of you are familiar with Sweet Farm Sanctuary. They were so affected by fires in California that they ultimately decided to move their sanctuary and all of their animals across the country to New York State. And they consider themselves climate refugees and have made climate, a core part of their mission. Another way to think about how climate change will affect animals is to think about all of the movement of people that will result from climate change. Climate change will bring an unprecedented migration of people. So in this country alone, it's estimated that 13 million people will be displaced from the coasts, further away from the ocean as sea level rises. And you can imagine how that will impact all of the animals that are in those people's lives. Hurricane Katrina is the event that comes to mind when you think about what can happen to animals in disasters when there isn't a provision made for their evacuation with people. There's really, it was so chaotic and there's no good data on this, but the estimate is that somewhere between 60,000 and 70,000 companion animals died in the aftermath of Hurricane Katrina. It's just devastating. And I moved to Baton Rouge, Louisiana, a few years after Katrina, and got to know a lot of the animal rescue folks there in Baton Rouge who had contributed to the life-saving response in New Orleans. And just heard incredible stories about, they were trying to get into the city as often and as long as they could and searching the abandoned buildings for animals and finding fewer and fewer animals alive, really heart-wrenching stories. And one of the sort of most prominent animal rescuers in Baton Rouge, Pam Levy, she told me that as they went, there came a time when the only living animals they were finding anymore were fish, and they would rescue the fish. And I just saw she posted this weekend that one of the fish that she rescued in 2005 from an apartment building in New Orleans, she named him Rex. He has lived with her until just recently where he passed away. So for 18 years, he was a Texas cichlid and she gave him the best possible life she ever could. And that was her last Hurricane Katrina survivor that was with her. Heat is also directly harmful to animals. In the summer of 2022, there were mass die-offs of cattle in Kansas. At least 2,000 cattle died. It was a welfare and also an environmental catastrophe for local people there. This summer, the USDA Farm Service Agency, the administrator of that agency, observed, this is a quote, that quote, heat domes plaguing many parts of the country have proven unsurvivable for animals. That's this past summer. And I'll just finish up with wildlife. I think a lot of us think about wildlife when we think about the climate impacts on animals. And that's for a good reason. Wildlife are very vulnerable to the impacts of climate change. Some of them may be able to migrate and to adjust and to move to areas that are hospitable. But one of the unfortunate facts about wildlife and climate change is that even as the hospitable area of the environment may move on the map, the current protected areas that we have set up, they don't move. So I remember years ago hearing a researcher from the University of Pretoria in South Africa speaking, and he said, you know, we've done the best we can to protect elephants in Africa. We have this system of protected areas that we have worked very hard on through all this international cooperation, and we are protecting elephants as best we can. But if I look forward decades into the future, these protected areas are no longer going to be the areas that are hospitable for elephants. That area is going to move on the map, and it's going to be up in this heavily populated area where elephants are going to have a very hard time living there. There's going to be more human-elephant conflict, and that's one of the challenges for wildlife. You also have disasters affecting wildlife. I'm sure everyone in this room remembers the devastating bushfires in Australia in 2019. It burned 18 million hectares and killed dozens of people. And the estimates are that it harmed or killed 3 billion animals in that event. And a great thing that climate scientists are doing, they understand, you can't say that any one of these events was caused by climate change, but what climate scientists have gotten very good at doing is estimating the percentage that the climate change contributed to the conditions that give rise to each one of these events. So the Australian bushfires, researchers found that climate change increased the risk of those weather conditions that drove the fires by at least 30%. And you'll see the scientists now getting out into the popular press as soon as they possibly can after these disasters to try and really make the connection for the public. Wildlife also are vulnerable to illness and disease as a result of climate change. I live in New England and have heard devastating stories on NPR about what's happening to moose over the winter because ticks that used to die off in the winter are living over the entire season, and they're finding moose dying of anemia covered in 90,000 ticks. It's an unprecedented situation for them. So if you pick any wildlife species that you care about, they are probably already affected by climate change. They almost certainly will be affected by climate change. And that is sadly on top of all of the other pressures that we put on animals and wildlife from habitat loss, pollution, wildlife trade, hunting, all of the other harms that we visit on them during this 6th mass extinction. This is all part of the reality and why some scientists are saying that we are in a new geologic epoch that we can call the Anthropocene. This is the period in which human activity is having a dramatic effect on climate and on ecosystems.
Yes, it's quite unfortunate how animals are almost dually victimized here because their exploitation is contributing to the problem, but then they're also being victimized by the problem itself. So it's really quite sad. So Pam, Dana covered SDG 13 to some extent, but because we have 17 of them, are there other SDGs that are potentially fruitful for animal welfare?
Well, I would argue that all 17 have an animal welfare aspect to it, or we're thinking about animal welfare principles would help them achieve these SDGs. I'm not going to talk about all 17, but I'll just maybe highlight just a few. And so the first one I want to highlight is goal number 3, and that one is good health and well-being. And if you think about our use of animals and how that contributed to the pandemic, if you think about wildlife trade, if you think about wet markets, just that alone, if we are able to shift what we're doing in that one element alone, it could possibly reduce the incidence of more zoonotic diseases. But even beyond that, you think about how, antibiotic resistance, you think about all of the ways in which we are using animals in an industrialized way, which really ends up having a negative impact on human health. So that's one very obvious one. You also have Sustainable Development Goal number 2, which is zero hunger. And again, you've heard from some wonderful speakers this entire weekend about the inefficiencies, in addition to the harms and the cruelty of the industrialized farming processes. It's like if we were able to switch that up and use more of the land that is currently being used to raise crops to feed the animals that are in the industrial ag business, to maybe raise crops and other types of nutritious foods, we would be able to more efficiently feed the world with more nutritious food and reduce harm. I mean, so that's another SDG. SDG 12 is responsible consumption and production. So what about sustainable or responsible fishing, if that can exist? And I know that there is some question about that, but there are ways perhaps to engage in animal husbandry or animal agriculture, which is going to reduce the number of animals involved, be more humane, and be a little bit more sustainable, which would help with responsible consumption and production. And then there are a couple toward the end, SDG 14, which is life below water, and SDG 15, which is life on land. And the purpose of 14 is to protect and sustainably use the ocean, seas, and marine resources. And SDG 14 is to protect, restore, and promote sustainable use of terrestrial ecosystems. So obviously, the impact on animals in both of those SDGs is obvious and huge, but can we be looking at habitat conservation? Can we be looking at ethical wildlife trade? Is that even possible? Can we be looking at overall environmental conservation? All of those things would improve the welfare of the animals that are living in those environments and would also help meet those SDG goals. And frankly, I think that the SDG goal number 17, which is the last one, and it's entitled Partnerships for the Goals, and it's really the implementation goal. And that's the one that I think we can weave animal welfare into almost the most effectively, because it really impacts every single one of the SDGs. And it's like, okay, we need to partner. It's that one health notion that we were talking about before, just this nexus between animals, the environment, reducing poverty, making sure no one's left behind. All of these are principles that are talked about a lot at the UN level, and animal welfare plays an enormous role in all of that. And interestingly, so this year I had the opportunity to attend a couple of different sessions at the UN. One was to look at, okay, how do we restart our focus on the SDGs in light of the fact that we just went through this global pandemic and everything's kind of came to a screeching halt. And then they had the big UN Assembly in September, which was the halfway point. So it started in 2015, we're about the halfway point for 2030. So it was, okay, let's see where we are with the SDGs. It was a halfway point. And at the meeting in September, it was all of the world leaders. Of course, peons like me were way up in the peanut gallery. They weren't letting any of us anywhere near them. But the presidents and prime ministers of all of these countries were getting up. They each had 3 minutes. And they were talking about the SDGs and what was happening. And almost to a person, the message was, we are so far behind. It's a disaster. We have got to start making some movement right now. We have got to make sure that we're serving our people appropriately. And with only one exception that I'm aware of, nobody said anything about animal welfare. Not one person. The only person who brought something up was somebody who was from the Federal Republic of Germany. It wasn't their president, it was somebody who works with them. And she mentioned the benefits of going to a plant-based diet. It's like, what? It's kind of in passing, but it was like, whoa, and all of us who were sitting there, who were there on behalf of the animals, we all looked at each other and went, wow, this is great. But what was discouraging, quite frankly, for me, was to hear that there was nobody else who was making that mention. So part of what I think all of us can be doing, part of the challenge is that there's not enough information that is flowing to the decision makers. And a lot of people are working on this, but we need more people working on this. The Swedish Environment Institute is doing fabulous work. I know Jeff Sebo and people at NYU, Dana and her group at Yale doing amazing, with people at Harvard are doing amazing work. So there are wonderful people who are working on this issue specifically, but there needs to be more, and we need to be getting more information, because part of the problem is just a lack of understanding, a lack of that they're making those connections. And so one of the things I would love to talk to any of you about at any time, please feel free to reach out to me, is if you would like to get involved, because we really need a lot of people. I know I think I saw Gladys was here a little bit earlier. I'm like, ooh, Gladys Kamasanyu, who is the chief magistrate of the Ugandan Wildlife Court and an LLM graduate of Lewis and Clark. But I was thinking, oh, we need to bring her to the Ugandan mission, because they might listen to her if she's talking about, given her elevated position of authority and power in the country. We need to be able to be making those inroads with all 193 of these member states. So anyway, I invite anybody who would like to get involved to please contact me or to contact Dana, and there are things to do.
Absolutely. I think given how interconnected and interdependent all of these different aspects, animal protection, environmental protection, human health and rights, human rights are, it's almost mind-boggling to think of trying to fix one of them in a silo without incorporating the others. So Dana, turning back to you, how can we recalibrate our relationship with animals such that we can actually meaningfully address the climate crisis?
Yeah, it's actually a really positive thing in this space, is that if we correct our treatment of animals and start protecting animals, it can have a really direct, high impact climate benefit. One of the most beautiful things that I've learned about since working in this space is there's all of this emerging research and evidence that protecting ecosystems, and specifically protecting animals, can really help the climate situation. So just as one example, earlier this year, a new study led by a researcher at the Yale School for Environment looked at 9 wildlife species, both on land and at sea: marine fish, whales, sharks, gray wolves, wildebeest, sea otters, musk oxen, forest elephants, bison, a great variety of species, and found that their activity, so they forage, they distribute seeds, they distribute nutrients over the land and the seascape, they trample and compact soil, and it all has a really dramatic carbon storage impact. So the lead researcher of that study said, quote, "This interaction means rewilding can be among the best nature-based climate solutions available to humankind," which I think is a really beautiful synergy. We keep talking about the interconnectedness. And then, of course, animal agriculture. I spent a lot of time about how impactful animal ag is on the climate. We can back away from that. A lot of experts say that one of the most impactful things any individual can do if they have access to food security and food choices is to reduce or stop consuming animal products, meat and dairy. It can have a huge impact. And I always like to observe Jennifer Jacquet from NYU, who we heard from earlier, such an amazing scholar and person and advocate. This is a quote from her on this topic, talking about the difference between food systems and energy systems. She says, "There's a key difference between these industries, and that's consumer preferences. Americans may not have much choice about the source of the electricity that lights their homes, but they do choose to eat what they eat 3 times a day. And these choices are particularly important in countries like ours, where our per capita consumption of animal products is so high, and where we have a real historic responsibility for emissions from food system and from energy, and where we, if we have access to options, we should be taking them, and we should be encouraging our leaders and policymakers to pursue policies that will empower people to make more sustainable and humane food choices."
Thank you. And
yeah.
Yeah, and clearly something needs to change and it needs to change soon. So my next question for you, Pam, and you touched upon this a little bit when you were answering the last question about the lack of data and the right information not getting to where it should be getting to world leaders. But are there other challenges that you foresee or that you've experienced in including animal welfare in the SDGs?
Yeah. Well, there are, and of course, one of the main issues, and I've already touched on this, is the competition for funding. It's just, it's enormously expensive. And so, I mean, just the UNEA resolution that I talked about, we don't even have the funding yet in place just to even get a report that's going to look at the nexus between the animal welfare issue and all of these other problems. So you can imagine, on a larger, more global scale, the amount of money that is necessary. I also think that so much of the implementation of the SDG goals can be done at the NGO level and can be done on a very, very local level. And so I think, you know, one of the challenges is finding out where those organizations are, what kind of work they're doing, and making sure that they're well supported. And I mean, so for example, the donkey, I think it's called the Donkey Rescue organization, which is based in Ethiopia. And one of the things that they do is they work with local people who use donkeys in labor and transportation to educate them and support them in terms of the welfare of those donkeys. They provide veterinary care so that the donkeys are healthier. And so this is wonderful. The donkeys are in better health, and it helps the workers because then the donkeys are able to work a little bit more effectively and efficiently. And this goes directly to SDG number 1, which is, okay, we're going to try to reduce poverty. SDG number 2, we're going to try to reduce hunger. I mean, so if we can find some of those organizations, I think that would go a long way. And there are some great people doing some really, really great work. And the other thing too that I think to keep in mind along those lines is that, you know, right now we're talking about the UN as the sort of this international framework, but there are other international frameworks that are in play right now. And I want to give a shout out, especially to my colleague Raj Reddy at Lewis and Clark Law School, because he's been doing all sorts of work on putting together an animal welfare treaty and working at the WHO level. And so I encourage you also to reach out to Raj because I know that they would enjoy your help. And I also want to talk about another organization that you should probably check out is the World Federation for Animals. And so the World Federation for Animals was formed in 2020, and it was because of this recognition that something needed to be happening on more of an international level. And so they brought together, it's an organization of organizations. So right now they have 54 member organizations, including large ones like Mercy for Animals and Four Paws and the RSPCA. And so together what they do is they try to come up with some consensus among these organizations around the world. And they are trying to bring looking at the UN level, looking at the SDGs, and then bring that message to critical policymakers at the UN level. And they are putting together policy papers, they're doing all sorts of work. So it's an organization that I know they're always looking for volunteers. If you happen to head an organization, an NGO, and you're interested in membership, you can check out their website. But they've only been around since 2020, and already they're starting to have an impact. I mean, they were very involved in Nairobi when the UNEA resolution was passed. So I think that I didn't exactly answer your question. I think I had touched on a lot of the things before, but it's, you know, cultural and political issues, it's funding, it's just, you know, how do we prioritize this? And also a lot of member states are saying, you know what, we really think animal welfare is important, but the SDGs is not the place to manage it. If you do that, you're going to dilute the purpose of the SDGs, which is really economic development for people. And if we start adding animal welfare in there, it's going to further restrict development, which is going to harm the humans. I disagree with that perspective, but it's a perspective that we hear quite a bit. Yeah.
And so, Dana, you mentioned in your presentation about the upcoming COP for the for the Paris Agreement. And so what are the hot topics that are likely to come up there?
Yeah, I think it's going to be a very exciting year for food systems and animals at COP28, which, in past years, food systems have not been a major topic of discussion at the Framework Convention conferences of the parties, which is surprising because food systems are very much at risk from climate. One paper from a couple of years ago predicted that at then current trajectories, about 1/3 of all food systems were at risk from climate. So it's a big deal. And, we talked about animal agriculture responsible for between 11 and 20% of all emissions. When you look at all agriculture, again, hard to estimate, but it's something between 1/4 and 1/3. So how is this international body getting together and not talking about a cause of emissions that is 1/4 to 1/3 of all of the emissions? There's a lot of research that shows that if we only focus on fuel systems and energy and don't look at the food system, we will not be able to reach the Paris climate goals. So we have to do it. Why hasn't food been a focus before? It's some of these same reasons that, Pam was just talking about. Some of it is because we have a division in the UN system. We have the Framework Convention on Climate and the climate mechanisms. And then we have the Food and Agriculture Organization, which is a separate body. But it's also all of these barriers that all of us who work on food system issues encounter in many different settings. There's these personal, intimate, cultural aspects of food choices that can be difficult to confront. There is this narrative or a myth of the family farmer that it's been deployed very successfully by agribusiness. There's the influence of industry and politics, and themes we keep hitting on. There's a relative lack of public awareness of the role of food systems in the climate crisis. In good news, this year is going to be different. In part, that's because advocates have been screaming at the prior COPs to really try and get attention. It's also because the United Arab Emirates, the host country, decided to focus on food systems. Cynically, maybe that's because they're a major fossil fuel producer and also an investor in ag tech. The president of this year's COP will be Sultan Al Jaber. He is the UAE Minister for Advanced Technologies. He's also the CEO of the National Oil Company. So his appointment as the president of COP has been really heavily criticized. In any event, he is very interested in food systems, and he has said that this will be a focus. What's going to happen this year? There's going to be a dedicated food day that has never happened. There's going to be a food for climate pavilion that has never happened. The Food and Agriculture Organization has promised to release a roadmap for how to achieve 1.5 degrees Celsius in the food and agriculture sector. This is the first roadmap we've ever seen from the FAO. So that's going to be a really major event. And there's also going to be a declaration available for signature on food systems, agriculture, and the climate. And that's going to ask countries to embed food system emissions in their national climate goals. Right now, only a minority of countries actually include food systems in their goals. And a senior advisor to the COP28 food systems team says that they expect anywhere between 50 and 100 countries to sign this declaration. So, we don't exist in an ideal world. I'm sure this is not going to accomplish, all the things that we in this room would love to see accomplished. But there's going to be major change, I think, on food systems coming out of this COP28. And throughout, a lot of advocates and reformers are saying through this process, we have to emphasize and focus on reductions in consumption in these high consuming, high producing, some of the literature calls them excess protein countries like the United States. We have to focus on reducing consumption in those countries. And in less high consuming, less wealthy countries, we instead should focus on food security, nutrition, and adaptation of food systems. So it's very important in the international context to acknowledge that every country is differently situated as to these issues. So stay tuned. I'm really eager to see what happens in Dubai.
It's very, very exciting.
And it was interesting. I mean, along those same lines, it was interesting when I was at the UN summit in September. I'm sure you read it all about it. It was also Environment Week, and they had the SDG Action Weekend, and it was incredible to see in New York. I mean, these huge marches and huge protests, and all these organizations coming together. I mean, so they're there is a lot of energy and a lot of momentum. I mean, there's a lot of work to do, but I'm also hopeful that things can change. And it's going to take all of us.
Thank you. And before we open it up to the audience for Q&A, I have a last question for you, Pam. Can you provide an example of a successful initiative or project that addressed both the SDGs and animal welfare, and if there are any lessons we can learn from it?
Yeah. So I talked about the donkey sanctuary earlier. So that's one example, but the Wildlife Conservation Society, it works to protect wildlife and their habitats in different countries. And so that aligns with SDG 15, which is life on land and protecting biodiversity. And it also supports SDGs like clean water, which is SDG 6, and reducing poverty, which is SDG 1. World Animal Protection focuses on improving the welfare of working animals in various countries. And so by enhancing the lives of these animals that play a crucial role in agriculture, it contributes to SDG 1, no poverty, and SDG 8, which is decent work and economic growth. And, I'm also going to talk about Heifer International. And I know that in this room, that might be a little bit controversial, but again, we need to be thinking about context, and we need to be thinking about things very, very holistically. And what they do is they operate in multiple countries, and they help communities lift themselves out of poverty through animal husbandry. So they provide families with animals like cows, goats, and chickens. And so through that, and they provide support in terms of caring for these animals and appropriate animal husbandry practices. So it does address SDG number 1, no poverty, SDG 2, zero hunger. And it also promotes sustainable agricultural practices and animal welfare, which align with SDG 15, life on land. So I think the lessons that we can learn from some of those projects are the following. I think, first of all, local empowerment. And I talked about that a little bit earlier, just like finding these NGOs that are able to work at the local level. Sometimes that can be the most effective thing. These are projects that address both SDGs and animal welfare, and they can involve these local communities and empower them to take ownership of the well-being of these animals. Sustainable practices. If you're able to have healthier animals, they are going to be able to live longer. They might be able to provide more productive labor for you. And I know, again, and there are probably those in this room who say we shouldn't be using animal for labor at all, but I want you to just consider different contexts within which that might actually be the best alternative. Health and well-being. Many of these projects indirectly improve human health and well-being by ensuring the welfare of these animals. So, for example, healthier livestock can provide better nutrition and livelihoods for communities. Biodiversity conservation. Those that are working on that, it protects not only the animals, but also it safeguards biodiversity. And preserving biodiversity is essential for ecosystem stability, clean water, and climate action. So that's SDG 13, 14, and 15 right there. And the other lesson is just collaboration. Successful initiatives often involve collaboration between local communities, NGOs, governments, and international organizations. It can foster knowledge, information. It just promotes, working together to try to find solutions that will help everybody. And relatedly, these can be very holistic approaches that benefit animals, the environment, and people. And as I was mentioning, some of the SDG goals that could be impacted by some of these projects, you can see that the goals are interconnected. And if you start down one path where you're looking at animal welfare, it really can impact so many of these goals. So learning some of those lessons and trying to apply them in different contexts and in contexts that are increasingly more progressive in terms of the animals' interests. I mean, that's really the goal. And but we have a little bit of a start here. And that's, I think, reason for some hopefulness.
Thank you. What a great discussion. If we can get a round of applause for our wonderful panelists. So I believe we have a couple of minutes for questions from the audience. So if you have a question, please line up behind one of the two mics in front of the room. And for those joining us virtually, you can submit questions via the Q&A icon at the bottom of your screen.
Hi, my name is Mariah Bowman. It's a pleasure to meet you and hear you all speak today. So plans are underway for the first international treaty on plastics. I was wondering if you think this may be a potential avenue for the protection of animal health and welfare, and if you think there are particular member states that may be able to advocate on behalf of this issue. Thank you.
I don't know much about it. It's a great question. And Dana and I were just saying, we don't really know too much about that treaty. So even though I don't know the details, I do know that plastics radically negatively impact animals, terrestrial animals, and aquatic animals. So to the extent that there are provisions that there is an agreement where we're trying to reduce the number of plastics that are being created, that we're trying to figure out ways to recycle them, to refine it, to come up with biodegradable products, that can, in my view, only help the animals. And I also know that, unfortunately, the plastics and the microplastics, the microbeads that are in the environment right now are going to be with us for a very, very long time. So this is, I mean, it was interesting listening to Ed Young last night talk. He was talking about the light pollution and how, hey, you just switch pull the switch and you can resolve that issue pretty quickly. But with some of these other things, there's still the ramp up. Even if we stop today, there's still this ramp up time of decades before we can resolve it. So it seems to me, again, without knowing the details of it, that something that is going to address plastics in a meaningful way can only be helpful for the animals. I don't know if you want to add anything to that.
Yeah, I agree with all of that. I think it's wonderful, and I don't know a lot about it, but I'm encouraged that these discussions are happening.
Any other questions?
Hello, my name is Griffith, and I wanted to ask about the life underwater focus of the UN's goals for 2030. I was wondering if these UN emission numbers are only regard terrestrial animal agriculture, and if not, how is the life underwater goal mobilized?
So that's another great question. I have the exact descriptions of the SDGs with me. And so I thought it might be helpful to just so that you can hear what they are. And let me just find that one. I don't know if you have any thoughts while I'm looking for this exact, or Hira, if you have any thoughts about this.
I believe this is SDG, I think 13 maybe, or it was either 13 or 14, I believe.
So, okay, life below water. So the description of it below, I mean, when you think about when it's described, it says the oceans are critical for global habitability, regulating climate and supporting the livelihoods of over 3 billion. However, 30% of fish stocks are overexploited, and ocean acidification has risen by 26% due to human carbon emissions. Marine pollution, primarily land-based, is pervasive, with 13,000 pieces of plastic litter per square kilometer. The SDG aims to manage and protect marine ecosystems, address ocean acidification, and enhance conservation and sustainability through international law. So I think your question was asking, okay, so is this SDG really just focusing on the animals that are in the water, not so much the terrestrial aquatic animals? Is that correct? Or, I mean, can you?
Oh, probably yes. I figured most of the statistics you were citing were about terrestrial animal usage. So I was just wondering how sea animals work into this equation.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So they're, I mean, if they have a life in the water, they are obviously covered. And even if they, I mean, and the next SDG is life on land, so they're trying to cover both of those elements. And so, yes, I mean, with the aquatic animals that have a life both on land and in the water, they would certainly be covered. But I will say that most of the conversations that I've heard in relation to this particular SDG really is talking about fishes, fishes and other animals that spend their entire life in the water. So that's not that they're not paying attention to seals or polar bears or other animals that are both in and out, but there does seem to be more emphasis on on those animals that live exclusively in the water. I'm not sure if that answered your question or if.
I will add that so as there's more and more recognition of the harmful impacts of industrial animal agriculture on land, aquatic food production, it's already ramping up. It's already increasing massively, and aquaculture specifically is being seen as the next the solution really to all of these problems. And in that sense, it's being blue washed or greenwashed as the sustainable solution to our food problems. But there's a number of problems with that as well. With aquaculture, it has implications for the environment, for animal welfare, for human health, and we can talk about that later, but because we're out of time. But yeah, it's definitely concerning and something to keep an eye out for, because it's being considered as something as a quick fix to as an alternative to industrial animal agriculture.
Yeah.
So we're out of time. Thank you again for joining the discussion.